Meanwhile, I'm delighted to hand over to my colleague, friend, and fellow moderator, Stefan Schmidt-Wulffen, who is the rector of the Academy of Art in Vienna, to introduce the first of our wonderful lineup of speakers. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the day.
Yes, good morning again, and welcome to the first panel. I'm not a speaker, I'm a catalyst, so I will be very brief. Nonetheless, let me return to some questions which were at the beginning of the plans to do a symposium like this. We were all aware that art in the social has a long history, and it has a very strong history in the U.S. Apparently, AIDS activism and ACT UP in the late 70s was something like a focus which redefined artistic activism in that country. And group material some years later, and in relation to this, in a way, seemed to have institutionalized this type of scene-wide protest. It seemed to us that the root of artistic activism in the States, nonetheless, was completely different to what happened, for instance, in Germany in the late 80s and early 90s. So we designed a panel focuses on this tension between a kind of American type of political artistic activism and something developing in Germany, a little bit in Great Britain, very little, I think, in France and Italy. So the two speakers who will talk to you now, in a way, stand in for this tension. We will then ask what happened in other fields of public artistic work. A label is New Genre Public Art, and a good example is the exhibition Culture in Action in Chicago. And I think it's a very interesting question to relate the work of group material, or even the work of ACT UP, to something like Culture in Action, where an artistic method, a paradigm, suddenly was formulated, which became a kind of institutional power for the art world. And in a third step, we have to come to the label of relational aesthetics, a very important term in explaining and theorizing what happened in the 90s. So we have three steps during the day. But let's begin with activism and the situation in the US and later in Germany. It's a pleasure to welcome Doug Ashford, who worked with group material since '82 until the end of group material in 1996. And I think that when we met, we had a discussion on why group material, in a way, finished its work. Doug is today associate professor at Cooper Union and teaches design, sculpture, and theory since '89 there. He has taught their interdisciplinary seminars and lecture series since many years. I should mention his recent publication, Who Cares? And it's a book with conversations between him and many cultural practitioners. I should maybe mention, in reference to what Charles said, until now we had curators as the main focus of the books. Here, and I should stress this, we have two artists who represent important curatorial work in the 90s. Apparently, the fact that artists took over is a very interesting and important issue we should discuss. I want also to welcome Renate Lorenz. She is now a researcher at the Freie University in Berlin in a project called Performative Cultures. And I think it's very interesting that if you do a scientific research on performativity today, apparently it's important to have an artist as one of the researchers. Renate Lorenz was in the early 80s connected to an artist initiative called Minimal Club. And this artistic Bureau Bert. And I think it's very important to say that these initiatives, like Bureau Bert or Minimal Club, in a way, had a huge field of different practices. In those times, I was doing exhibitions in a kind of Kunstverein, in an institution, and in a way, we all felt that working in an institution was a little bit like working in a cage. We had similar tools, like these groups of artist activists, but the range to use them had apparently another impact. Renate Lorenz did a recent artwork with Pauline Baudry, which I should mention, and her field is queer theory and gender discourse. She did a conference last year in Berlin with the title Freaky Queer Art Conference, and she's also regularly contributing to publications and is a co-editor to Copy Shop, a very important publication of the 90s. I'm very proud to say that Renate Lorenz finishes her work in Berlin at the end of the year and will come to Vienna to support a new PhD program which we start. So we're very happy to have her with us. Doc, would you start?
Why not? Hi. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Charles. Thanks for organizing this. I'm a bit nervous. I don't do public talks very often. I introduce other speakers. So we'll see how this goes. We're running a bit late. Do you want me to try to cut it a little bit short so we can catch up? All right. I'm going to try to get through it. I have some reflection going on right now because the history of group material has just been brought together in a book published by Four Corners Press. There'll be a release in a few weeks here in London and a launch party, and I hope everybody goes. I have some flyers. I'll try to pass them out. These historical moments are somewhat complex, especially when they're spoken from the point of view of the practitioners themselves. I appreciate that in the introduction, Stefan, about this idea that there was a kind of parallel productive practice going on through the 80s and 90s, one from artists and one from people invested in museum practice on site. It is a difference, and it will be interesting to discuss about it, to discuss it later. I have the clicker here. I have to make sure this works. So I'm beginning this talk with an image by Bernard Picard. This image is called On the Plurality of Worlds. I want to present it to begin with as a kind of a metaphor for the idea of our social turn. And I want to present it as a notion that this idea is very old and also very cosmological, perhaps even metaphysical. This image was rendered for a
17th century book of the same title that proposed that human dialogue, that is the conversations we have between us, actually creates an influence on the character of the universe. It's a proposal that social interaction changes the nature of the world. I found this picture recently when researching how to try to archive the work of group material and to sort of try to see if there were other histories of ways to organize knowledge that would be, I don't know if semi-fixed, but would be as open as possible, and that I could figure out a way in which those histories, with my colleague Julie Ault, could become part of a rethinking of modern democratic urgency in general. For me today, any discussion of group material demands a kind of investment, an investment in the metaphysics of social practice, of the social practice that we had, an investment in a kind of abstract beginning of what drove us to our form and maintained the changing collective of artists that made up group material for almost 15 years. Yeah, I'll try this. To begin a discussion of the social turn with a reference to its metaphysical origins may sound unorthodox, especially considering that the historical example of our work and the democracy project in general, which I'm here to discuss today, have been discussed in relation to art as a political instrument, as a tool of activism, as a tool of production of virtue. It's true, we did believe that the art world contained tremendous resources in wealth, in influence, and in status, and that as artists we could perhaps do something that would directly harness those resources to complete social projects of economic liberation and social awareness. But by the time the Democracy Project was actually produced, we also had something else going on. We saw that the museum proposed another more philosophical, political investment, where what it means to be a human subject could be defined and debated, and the terms of such a subjectivity could be discussed outside of the existing protocols of social interaction. This was a place where people could live both inside and outside themselves, inside and outside their mediums of expression. And our medium of expression, the art exhibition, could make a view into others, something that performs politics as an element of something that is beautiful, a place to model unavailable forms of social life in the abstract proposals of artworks. So what I want to do here this morning is trace parts of this question of the social turn in art and its possible metaphysical understandings through group materials work, first by examining some sources for our exhibition practice, then by going over in detail the group's Democracy Project. Democracy Project was produced from 1987 to 1989 by myself, Julie Ault, and Felix Gonzalez Torres. There are clearly some stunning changes that have taken place as the social turn has become enfolded since then into the way museums work. But I'm not quite so sure how to describe them, particularly since museum experience in America has for some time now given itself up to more corporate agendas. I'm hoping such reflection is represented here, and I'm quite sure it will be, by more active participants in the social turn than myself these days presently, and by people who are more actively invested in the formation of institutional ideas of art. Also, I really don't have any strong feelings to buttress, any strong proof to buttress my feelings that these kind of practices do produce a sense of recognition beyond kinship, belief, and ideology, and maybe even beyond the idea of the human. But I do know that I found these ideas and feelings about the exhibition and what it can produce in audiences working with group material for the 15 years that I did. So before I begin to discuss the Democracy Project itself, I want to go back a little bit and describe a few of our earlier works. These are a little different, these slides, than the ones I thought I had. But let's get started. I'll go back here. Group material began out of desperation. That's the important idea. It was artists who were desperate, who felt a sense of urgency. And this urgency continued through the more mature work that I discussed today. We were desperate with the idea that our work would not be shown, or that if it was shown, it would be seen as a mere commodity, that our complexities of our own subjectivities could not be written in this world, and that if they were, they would not be understood. So in this way, group material was a collaboration of necessity, of money and time put together by a group of artists to rent a space in the tradition of making a new space, a room of one's own. We thought that the true complexity of artistic experience was overlooked both by the narrow scholarship of existing museum studies and the commodified taste culture within the existing framework of gallery reception. We thought that this dual degradation on the social effect of art could be countered with a designed intervention using an ensemble of activities brought together collaboratively by artists and new audiences. This was not our invention. We found it in the art making that came before us, in a Courbet, in a Mayakovsky, in a Clifford Still, in a James Brown, in a Wallace Stevens, in a Paulo Freire, in Charles and Ray Ames. One way to see the practice is the idea of building one's own wonder cabinet, but one that could be reauthored in reaction to the status quo. The private reveries of experience produced in the wonder cabinet were not lost when it was confronted by the public sight of art collecting, the salon, the anti-salon, the anti-anti-salon, and so on. Dreams follow us into our work as we move from the cabinets of intimate connection and regal projection to the burgeoning democratic spaces of the Enlightenment's revolution. I try to understand that the associative modern historicisms that these images present, those of André Malraux and those of Abby Warburg, that make available to us a kind of autonomous misrecognition of existing protocol. I use that word, misrecognition, knowing that it may have no etymological shadow. Perhaps an invention, if you will allow me. I use it to imply that in these existing accepted trajectories for the collection and distribution of art, there are possible events for resistance, ways to upset the functionalist appropriation of art by dominating economies. But how can we insist on new misrecognitions inherent in the aesthetic play of the actual organization of the world? What do we have to do to see taxonomies of official history as a fiction? What if the categories of what is defined as human expand to include not just other humans, but the objects we make? As scholars and artists, we need to remind ourselves that this disruption, in a sense, is always already inscribed in the original categories of research. Even Linnaeus, with his tree of animal categories pictured here, admitted that one could not, in all the differences that one could not take in at one time all the differences and similarities that nature presents. I'm skipping this because we have time. To include disruption into a plan demands we retain the capacity to accept the collapse of that plan's expectation, that we dismantle existing definitions and subjects to go on learning what we are independent from, that one could, in a sense, be broken up through our artistic labor, broken into a different kind of subject, determined either in secret or in public between us and others, a ludic remaking of our labor. I would like to see the social in art as suggesting a kind of bathos, as something based in part on the aesthetic of falling, of surrender, and perhaps confusion, exemplified here in the image of this magical artwork called Trebuchet. It is a trap, forcing the visitor to lose control, to fall after walking a few steps into Marcel Duchamp's studio. So in a sense, group material began, sorry, I got the water in the thing. Too much going on at once. Group material began as a tool for a doubled collaboration. This is important, I think, in reflecting on the comments that we had in our introduction. By double collaboration, I mean that there was a collaboration between artists, the collective of artists itself, but also, and that collective would then become a collecting agent for our existing examples from other arenas and constituencies. One misunderstanding of group material's work, I think, is that it was based solely in movement politics. I think this is a misconception. It is certain that I don't remember a time when we were working to empower others. This is true. But we did have an idea, and we did have an idea of inclusive antagonism in all our interactions. This show, Primer, an exhibition for Raymond Williams, was produced with the idea, very early on in our practice, with the idea that objects culled from our friends and neighbors would produce an alternative archive for the experiences of art, an experience deduced from the beliefs of others. You can see here a James Brown poster, Dawn of the Dead, a Clash poster, a Solidarity t-shirt, a still from Godard film, a photograph of Che Guevara, and a drawing from Margaret Harrison. And also a map of El Salvador. This idea of collecting together the experience of those not in the room, or in a sense, in this exhibition, all linked to a lexicon of related words that you can see around the bottom of the gallery, an allusion to the notion of art as practice rather than product, the children's primer. GM saw GM saw the museum as a site of already existing social influence, a politics in itself and also of others. The reductive notion of institutions determining subjection as an engineer determines mechanical forms clearly was not useful. We wanted to address new audiences with concrete political descriptions, but with a form that would undermine accepted artistic and activist positions alike. This exhibition, called Timeline of U.S. Interventions in Central America, chronicled the 88 physical military interventions in Central and South America by the United States government between 1893 and 1984. But the show was also an essay on the misrecognition of art with time, or the misrecognition of us as individuals with time through art. With a Diego Rivera still life corresponding to the present, and a John Hartfield photomontage corresponding to the 19th century. To misrecognize history itself was an integral part of our insistence on remaking artistic values. The public spaces of the city then were no more or less a site for collective or reimagination than the gallery. Although it is true that publicity culture in 1984 and 1980 to 1987 may have seemed more open to the reinvention, emptied of the hierarchical expectations that accompanied archives and collections. In this project, Group Material was more a subcontractor than a designer. We took out a contract with a private agency that delivers advertising to the New York City subway system, and then invited artists to produce 27 placards apiece. 100 different artists made 2,700 placards. They filled the spaces built for the advertising on the IRT line, number 4, that runs from the Bronx through Brooklyn. Although there were many detournements in this project of commercial languages, one notable case, which I don't have a slide of unfortunately, was not a graphic or advertising kind of intervention, but was a physical painting. A woman did 27 paintings of a woman running. Amanda Church, the artist, did 27 paintings of a woman running out of a burning house. For some reason, at the time in New York, seeing a painting like that in the subway had a more disturbing relationship to people's understanding of public life than many of the more graphic-oriented detournements. I'm going to skip this too, so we have time. Oops, I did it again. I can't do this one-handed thing. I'm so sorry. Here we go. To a dialogic end, artifact and art could be hung together for us. Archive and collection could be dispersed, the hanging line of the commercial gallery overcome by an ensemble of feelings. AIDS Timeline is perhaps our most fluid example of this, a case where a newspaper editorial, a morbidity report from the National Institute of Health, an AIDS profiteer sticker produced by the PWA Coalition, and an abstract painting could all be hung together. To combine the editorial and the emotive was our purpose, the comparison of a B-2 bomber budget with the soundtrack of It's Raining Men, a possibility of resistance found in the emotional connection to a history one is experiencing as it happens. We tried to think of the aesthetic and the political together, formed within the project of art and its possible world for proposition, response, multiplying propositions. Hopefully it's evident through these examples that as group materials work matured, it became more and more clear that in order to oppose the oblivion of the present, a form had to be invented, a visualization of a democratic process. How else could an authentic response to the imposed disaster of contemporary life be seen? As artists, we knew that in the street and the symposia, forms of response were often beautiful. The collective and diverse declarations of the democratic have all the qualities of art, of improvisation, of comparison, proportion, and substitution. Despite the plethora of critical tracts produced during this time, it's important for me to remember that the practices of group material developed in a way that was barely theorized. Instead, suggested by the callings of the daily matter that we had as individuals in terms of life over death, be it the formation of Central American independence movements facing American-sponsored genocide, or the activist responses to official indifference and the AIDS epidemic. In other words, the form of our art making was produced through affinity with the forms of political work we ourselves were invested in, as laborers, as labor organizers, as public teachers, and as friends. Our form of exhibition and public practice reflected the need to invent a dynamic situation, a designed moment of reflection that could include discussion and present dissent. In 1987, the Dia Art Foundation, now the Dia Center, was under a kind of reorganization and sought, not unselfishly perhaps, to find a generative year of exhibitions to coincide with its new management. To that end, they invited group material to take over their Worcester Street space and produce work for half a year. For the rest of that year, a project was produced by Martha Rosler, who's speaking at our other conference in London today. The Democracy Project itself really was a quartet of practices: private meetings, exhibitions, public assemblies, and then a book collecting together the records of all our organizational events, combined with a series of texts that informed them. Democracy was our theme because it was already our form. The exhibition unanchored from the equation of thesis and promotion. Our adopted form was an analogy of the empty room, physically turned over to a stutter of inclusion, to dissensus and contestation, a site of constantly changing representation. Perhaps we thought, in aesthetic knowledge can be the beginning of a decentering of the self that has already been proposed by social movements for an emancipation in which people could face shared alienation. Perhaps that is part of the political nature of the emotional realignment we experience and share around any work of art. I guess this is maybe not too new an idea. But for the Democracy Project, our first thought was to do away with the idea of a singular curatorial selection altogether, to invent a kind of anything goes exhibition in which we would throw away the object list, we would go beyond the sort of metaphor of the exhibition as a space of authority, and insist on something in which there would be a directly engaged audience, an audience that would literally bring things to hang up, would actually move objects, an audience that would move the objects in and out of the gallery in response to the political reality of the day, to the week or the month, an exhibition that would change with whoever came that day. This became clear early on that such a liberalization was pretty unlikely, especially when faced with the actual task, the bureaucratic task of moving artworks that have historical significance around, like lifting a Joseph Beuys blackboard in and out of the showroom. So instead, we decided to treat democracy essayistically through the outline of 4 related thematic experiences that would trace 3 of America's great abstract promises and 3 of America's great abstract promises and America's failures in democracy, and ending with 1 exhibit as a case study on the most cogent failures we were living through at that time, the creation of the AIDS crisis due to governmental, media, and medical indifference. The titles of the 4 shows were Education, Politics in the Election, Cultural Participation, and AIDS, a case study. These 4 shows were hung in rapid sequence over about 6 months. Each had a different set of organizing visual principles, but there were consistencies throughout, like there's an American flag in each project. Each had different constituencies of reception, both imagined and explicit. For example, for AIDS, a case study, it reflected on the working activism of ACT UP. Education, the very first exhibition, included the organizations of teachers, activists, and unions. Each had a visual principle applied to their design that could evoke resonance. I'm sorry, I got lost here. Each had a visual principles applied to their design that could evoke resonance in their shared perceptions and moods. For example, in cultural participation, we had a raffle, and during politics and election exhibition, we had a ceiling full of red, white, and blue balloons. But more important for my argument here is the fact that in each we built contexts of social investment from others. We organized from the beginning a larger identity of authorship through invitation and associations to prove that all aesthetic forms are produced along with larger social relations, both those that are lived through our work and the relations that are imagined in identifying with things that are gone. I don't want to go on too much longer, but I'm just going to go over the social platform and try to end quickly. Because this idea of collaboration and how we organize it, I think, is something that's been repeated institutionally, but it has a kind of a different sense of organization, either because of the history of the 80s, because of the nature of the museum, or because of our youth and idealism. So the social platform that accompanied the exhibition was organized in 3 ways. First, this slide illustrates my wonderful colleague Julio and Felix Gonzalez Torres in one of the roundtable discussions. So for each exhibition, we had private meetings with other people who were invested in the topic. This also seated here is Judge Bruce Wright, a judge in New York City who was known as Turn 'em Loose Bruce because of the way that he refused to send welfare mothers to jail if their children were involved in theft. These meetings were attended by both artists and non-artists who could relate to the thematic contents of each show. They were experienced with the practices related to that show or were invested in the culture that those practices might produce. Secondly, in a less direct manner, but maybe more crucial, we sought out and invited constituencies and individuals from outside the realm of art. These communities of concern actually ended up producing the dynamism of exhibitions by creating works for the show, finding works from children, for instance, out of the public schools, and creating a situation in which communities of concern at the exhibition themselves could find themselves in friction and in dynamics with each other. And lastly, for each exhibition, we produced town meeting type assemblies that coincided both with the topic and the time period for each exhibition. We arranged for a large public platform for public discussion in a room not unlike this one. The original notion of our town meetings was to undo the notion of expertise, to replace the singularity of the proscenium with the multiplicity of the audience, to focus on inclusion in order so as not to mirror oppressive structures. As has been pointed out by others, this exalted notion of an organized dialogue often is only an emulation of real participation, the kind of mediegetic image of inclusiveness. But our original intention was to allude to the prototypical democratic experience in America, the town meeting, and to try to dissolve the demarcation between experts and initiates. Anyone in the audience was a potential speaker. Much of the discussion was built upon issues raised in the roundtable meetings that we had had before the exhibitions, but overall each was very different due to the changes in moderators and attendance. After the roundtables, exhibitions, and town meetings, we produced this publication, bringing together a variety of voices and points of view to address the issues of American democracy and provide possible means for responding to its challenges. The book was meant to address an audience far wider than could have actually attended the events. And I have to say, it has had that effect, particularly in the area of public education, where I spend most of my time working and thinking. I'm repeatedly rewarded by the interactions with teachers and community organizers who have seen this document as a menu of possibilities for education to continue its Jeffersonian mandate of breaking down the barriers proposed by race, class, and territory in America. Overall, all of our efforts in the Democracy Project were meant to try to see how democracy happens at the site of representation itself, not just where information is transferred or built, but rather at the very place we recognize ourselves in performing images, where we have the sense that we are ourselves, feel a stability that is hailed and recognized by others. A radical representational moment, whether collective or not, is one that suggests we can give ourselves over to a new vision through our feelings, through experiences linked to contemplation and epiphany. In this way, no public description of another, in frame or detail, can be presented as politically neutral. So when group material asked, how is culture made and who is it for, we were asking for something greater than simply a larger piece of the art world's real estate. We were asking that the relationship changes between those who depict the world and those who consume it, and demonstrating that the context for this change would question more than just the museum. It could turn into a contestation for all contexts of public life. In making exhibitions and public projects that sought to transform the In making public projects that sought to transform the instrumentality of representational politics, invoking questions about democracy itself, group material presented a belief that art directly builds who we are. It engenders us. I think I'm going to stop there so we have time to go on and hear Renata. Thank you very much.